Today's story is about one of the most haunted rooms in the world and what happens when you go inside of it. Now, this particular account is from 200 years ago, but the legend of what goes on inside of that room is still very much alive today. However, before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's bathroom and replace their toothpaste with Novocaine. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Late one evening in 1840, a 30-year-old British nobleman named Sir Robert Warboys stood next to 5 of his closest friends on the front porch of a townhome in one of the fanciest neighborhoods in London, England. The address of this townhome was 50 Berkeley Square, and it was one of dozens of these beautiful brick and marble townhomes that surrounded this big garden. The whole square had been built about 100 years earlier, and since then it had become one of the most fashionable places for the rich and famous to call home. However, Robert and his friends had not come here to rub shoulders with important people. Instead, Robert had come here to win a bet. So Robert actually was a nobleman. He was like this proper guy, at least on paper. But in reality, at least to his friends, he had a total wild streak. He loved taking on dares. Basically, anytime anybody, challenged him to do something, he would do it, especially if there was money on the line. But it wasn't really about the money. It wasn't about, winning money by doing these different things. He just loved the challenge. He loved the thrill of taking chances. So that night, on the front porch of this townhome, Robert turned and knocked on the front door. And then as soon as he did, he turned back and looked at his friends and grinned at them. And he saw some of them looked really excited and some looked pretty nervous. But to Robert, he was purely happy about how things were going so far. Because he knew, come tomorrow when this whole thing was done and he had won his bet, he would have a great story to tell. A few seconds later, the front door of the townhome swung open and this middle-aged man stepped outside. His name was Charles Benson, and while Robert and Charles did know each other, they were not close friends. They actually only knew each other because they both were members of the same exclusive gentlemen's club in London. Plus, pretty much everybody in London had at least heard of Charles because of all the rumors swirling around about what went on inside of his townhome. Even though Robert had told Charles that on this night he and his buddies were coming to his townhome for this bet, even though he had clearly told him, Charles still seemed very surprised to see Robert standing there. But Robert nonetheless was like, "Hey Charles, how are you? I'm here for the bet." And Charles basically didn't react. He just stared at Robert with this very concerned look on his face and just said, "Are you sure you really want to do this?" And Robert, who knew what he was referencing, just kind of looked down at the pistol on his hip and said, "Yeah, I'm sure." A few minutes later, Robert and his 5 friends were inside of Charles' townhome in the dining room, sitting around a table, while Charles had gone upstairs to get something. And as they sat there, Robert kind of looked around the room at his friends, and he could tell they were clearly more nervous about this than he was. And so he tried to, keep the mood light by making some jokes and kind of downplaying what he was about to do. But it was like no matter what he did, he could just tell his friends were very uneasy about what was going to happen here. And then a moment later, they heard the sound of Charles coming down the stairs. And Charles, he came in the kitchen, still with a very serious look on his face. And he walked up to them and he reached in his pocket and he pulled out this old iron key and he placed it in the middle of the table. And as soon as he did that, the room went completely silent and everybody just stared at this key. And then Charles eventually broke the silence and explained to the group that over the last 10 years of living in this townhome, he had only used that key maybe 2 or 3 times total. And when the key was not in use, Charles said he actually hid the key just to make sure it never wound up in the wrong hands. But now, again with that somber look on his face, Charles looked over at Robert and said, "If you're really sure about this, the key is yours to take." And Robert, with no hesitation, reached out and snatched the key, showing his friends and showing Charles that he was not about to get cold feet. A couple of minutes later, all the men stood up from the dining room table, and then Charles led the group up the thin, narrow, creaky staircase to the second floor. And when they got to the second floor, Charles led them down this narrow hallway that came to a stop in front of this closed door. At this point, all 7 men were kind of crowded together right in front of this door. But it was obvious that even though Charles lived in this townhome, he was sort of hesitant to get even close to this door. Like he really didn't want to be anywhere near it. Also, all of Robert's friends were sort of reacting the same way too. I mean, they were the ones that actually dared Robert to do this in the first place. But now that they were actually here, about to go through with it, they were looking at Robert like he was totally insane. And also they were kind of hoping that, maybe he would just back out and they could just leave. But Robert did not seem remotely like he was about to back out. He had a very determined look on his face, and as everybody else was kind of cowering away from this door, Robert stepped up, reached into his pocket, pulled out that iron key, and put it into the lock. And as he began to turn the lock, everybody else took steps farther away from him. And then he pulled open the door, and as he did, everybody gasped, and Robert even took a step backwards. But when Robert actually looked through the now open doorway, he just laughed, because it was just a normal bedroom. It was filled with all this old but very expensive looking furniture. On one side of the room was this big wooden dresser with a huge round mirror above it, and then on the opposite side of the room was this big 4-poster bed. And right above this bed, dangling down from the ceiling, was this red ribbon. Now, Robert knew that in a rich nobleman's house, there were ribbons like this one that are known as bell pulls. A nobleman could pull on that lever, and it was connected to a pulley system that rang a bell down in the servants' quarters. And when the servant heard that bell, they would see what room it was coming from, and they would go up to the room to see what the nobleman needed. And so after taking in the sight of this bedroom, Robert took a confident step into the room. And as soon as he did, Charles reached out and grabbed him by the wrist and said, "Hey, Robert, this is your last chance to change your mind. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" And Robert kind of looked back at his friends and smiled and said, "I'm sure. I'll see you guys tomorrow morning once I've won the bet." Then Robert released Charles's grip on his wrist, walked into the room, turned, shut, and locked the door. At this moment, Robert's friends didn't really know what to do. They were still sort of shocked that Robert was actually going through with this. I mean, even by his standards, this felt particularly reckless. They also felt kind of guilty. I mean, they were the ones who ultimately put him up to this. So, if Robert got hurt, which in theory could actually happen here, it would be partially their fault. And so Robert's friends turned to Charles to see what he was thinking. And Charles had this very grave, resigned expression on his face. And he just told them, "I have one more thing to show you before we go to bed." So Robert's friends followed Charles back down the hallway, down the stairs, past the dining room, towards the very back of the townhome. And when they got there, they found there was sort of like a studio apartment area back there. There was a kitchen area, a laundry area, and there were several beds. Charles explained this was where his servants lived and worked, but he had given them all the night off, because he knew it was possible that Robert and his friends would be here for this bet, and they would need a place to stay. Charles pointed to a space right above the beds where there was this row of all these bells in a horizontal line. Each of these bells were connected to various bell pulls throughout the house, and he pointed to one particular bell and told them that that was the one that was connected to the bell pull in the room Robert was staying in tonight. And so he said it was their job tonight to constantly monitor that bell all night. So somebody had to be awake all night listening to that bell, because heaven forbid if Robert pulls that bell, that was going to be the signal that something bad had happened in that room. And so their job was basically to be on guard all night to potentially run up and rescue Robert if he needed it. Last year, we launched our very first graphic novel, and it went great. I mean, it made the New York Times bestseller list, so thank you all so much for making that happen. But ever since this book came out, we have been hit with so many questions about, hey, when are you going to do another graphic novel? When's book 2 coming out? Well, I have an announcement to make. Check it out. We are doing a second graphic novel, and this is the official cover art. Here it is. This is Mrballen Presents Where Nightmares Live. It's going to have another set of 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, and it comes out September 30th. But you can pre-order it right now if you go to book.ballenstudios.com. Also, there's a link right here and in the description below. There are some signed copies available, but they will go quickly. So please head on over to book.ballenstudios.com to pre-order a copy of our newest graphic novel. I know you're gonna love it. Check it out. Your nightmares are waiting. Around 3 hours later, all of Robert's friends were sitting on the floor in the servants' quarters playing blackjack. It was almost midnight, and all of them were exhausted, but they were too on edge to sleep. They were so focused on this bell, and they were so worried about Robert and, wondering if he was really okay up there. And they also had become convinced that, maybe the bell would ring and they wouldn't hear it if they were making too much noise. And so they had made this decision to silently play blackjack and just focus exclusively on this bell. But it had really created a lot of extra tension in the room. They're basically all just staring at the bell, dealing one hand after another, paranoid it would go off, and wondering what would even happen if it did. And so hand after hand, the friends are playing blackjack, anxiously watching this bell being completely silent. And then suddenly they hear this sound that makes them all jump. But it wasn't the bell. It was a blood-curdling scream coming from upstairs. And for a moment, the friends just sat there in shock. And then they got up and began running out of the servants' quarters to see what was going on. And as they did, Robert's bell began ringing furiously, so loud it hurt their ears. And so they charge out of the servants' quarters and literally bump into Charles, who also is coming to figure out what's going on. And as a group, they begin running up the stairs to the second floor. And all the while, the bell is ringing furiously. There's screams coming from Robert's bedroom. And by the time they got to the second floor, suddenly everything went silent. The ringing stopped, the screaming stopped. They're in the second floor in that hallway, and it's just deadly silent. And up ahead of them is that closed door. And so Charles and the group, they begin walking down the hall, having no idea what to expect. And right as they're about to reach the door, they hear this loud bang sound. And then silence again. Seconds later, Robert's friends were at that door, pounding on it, screaming for Robert, come open the door, because Robert was the only one with the key. But Robert wasn't making any noise. The room was still totally silent. And so eventually the friends began kicking on this door to try to break it down. All the while, Charles is just kind of standing back in the hallway, watching this horrible thing unfold. And then finally, the friends manage to literally kick the door in. I mean, it's a 100-year-old house. The door gets kicked in, and the friends stumble into the room, and they look over towards the bedroom, and they all just freeze in shock. When Charles bought this townhome 10 years earlier, it came with a very dark backstory. The previous owner had apparently kept his violent and psychotic brother locked up inside of this second floor bedroom where Robert was. And after this brother died inside of this room, all these strange and frightening things began happening inside of this room. People began hearing these awful wailing sounds coming out of this room when nobody was in there. And then they'd go into the room and the wailing would stop, but furniture had been moved all around the room, even though, again, no one had been in there to do that. And then also, people began seeing this sort of amorphous gray figure sort of moving around inside of that room, especially at night, kind of slinking up against the wall and across the floor. And even though nobody had any idea what it was, it just felt like it was evil. And so they began calling it the nameless thing, and they referred to it as the physical manifestation of evil. However, not everybody believed this story. In fact, one person who absolutely did not believe the story was Robert Warboys. He thought this was just a tall tale designed to scare people. And so when his friends dared him to spend one night inside of that bedroom where supposedly the nameless thing lived, he happily accepted, because to him, it didn't seem risky at all. Spending one night in the haunted room was no big deal because it's not actually haunted. He'd be fine. And anyways, it would make for a great story to tell down at the Gentleman's Club. Unfortunately, though, the night in that bedroom did not go as Robert hoped. When Robert's friends burst through the bedroom door and looked inside, the first thing they noticed was the bell pull, the ribbon from the ceiling, had been yanked out of the ceiling, and Robert's pistol was on the ground next to the bed. And then on the other side of the room, there was a very obvious bullet hole in the wall. And so that was the loud bang sound they heard as they were coming down the hall. It was the pistol going off. And then there was Robert. Robert was laying on the bed, and he was totally rigid, and he actually was still clutching the red ribbon from the bell pull. And as they stared at him, they saw his eyes were wide open and bloodshot, and his lips were kind of pulled back in this horrible grimace with his teeth exposed. And for a second, his friends thought Robert must be having a seizure of some kind. That's why he was so tight on the bed like that. And so they ran to him, trying to snap him out of it. But as soon as they touched him, they realized that the reason he was rigid was not because of a seizure. It was because Robert was dead. That night, Charles would call the local coroner, who would come by and take Robert's body, and also he would open up an official inquest into Robert's death to figure out what had happened to him. And the verdict of this inquest was that Robert had died from massive heart failure caused by unknown circumstances. But to Charles and all of Robert's friends who were there that night and actually saw Robert in the room, it seemed plainly obvious that what had happened here was Robert had come in contact with the so-called nameless thing in that room, and it literally scared him to death. In the nearly 200 years since Robert's death, 50 Berkeley Square has had many different owners, and virtually all of them have reported either seeing, feeling, or hearing some sort of malevolent, ghostly presence inside of that second-floor bedroom. To this day, that particular bedroom, where the nameless thing apparently resides, is considered one of the most haunted places in the entire world. In case you haven't heard yet, our newest graphic novel, Mrballen Presents Where Nightmares Live, is available for pre-order right now. It contains another 9 heart-stopping, strange, dark, and mysterious stories, all based on real events. This was a passion project. It took a lot of time, a lot of people involved, from the artwork to the storytelling. I mean, this is a beautiful piece to add to your collection, so you gotta check it out. The book comes out on September 30th, but again, you can pre-order your copy at book.ballenstudios.com, or you can click the link in the description below. There are a limited number of hand-signed copies available, but those are gonna sell out very quickly. So please pre-order today, because remember, your nightmares are waiting. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. 10,000 feet up, deep inside of the beautiful Austrian Alps, lies a very unique and not well-known tourist destination. The only way you can get to this destination is to ride a gondola, or if you're feeling really motivated, you could, in theory, hike up to it, but very few people do that. Once you reach this tourist destination, you walk over to this string of buildings, and right away you start to see all these warning signs about this area, telling you that while of course it's stunning and beautiful, remember, it's also very dangerous. Today, I'm going to tell you a horror story that happened at this unique location. And make sure you stick around till the end, because there are actually 2 plot twists at the end of this story. The first one you might see coming, the second one you won't. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please go to the Like Button's big garage sale and proceed to haggle with them really aggressively over the prices of their most expensive items, to the point where they have to basically ignore their other customers just to deal with you. And then finally, when they relent and offer you a fair and decent price for these prized items, just say, nah, I'm actually not interested. I actually don't have any money. And then just leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On August 9th, 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams. But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break, because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, you know what, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm gonna just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains, he was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag, and then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier ski resort was a glacier. And so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem, because in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so Duncan, back down in the parking lot, he walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off, and then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting his snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top
of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off, very slowly making their way, kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain, he's a beginner, and so it's very slow, very controlled, and as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up, and very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player. And so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff. And when they got there, it had started to rain. And it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up, plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office, and by the end of the day it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you, and then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope. Last week, me and old Seagull Lung were wandering through Montreal when we turned onto this side street, and immediately we both stopped because right there in the middle of the road, laying unclaimed, was a fresh blue whale carcass. Now, Lung and I knew it was only a matter of time before somebody else came along, spotted this incredible treasure, and took it for themselves. And so without any hesitation, me and old Seagull Lung whipped out our portable meat smokers, and we got to work. And 99 hours later, our pockets were filled to the brim with glorious smoked street whale. However, when we tried to feed our smoked street whale to our friends and family at our annual summer barbecue, they took one bite and said, "This is kind of gross. What is this, smoked street whale?" And so, naturally, we were crushed by this, but luckily, we had a backup. HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. From chef-crafted seasonal recipes to their new Fresh and Fit summer menu, HelloFresh brings flavor right to your doorstep. And don't worry if you're a terrible cook, because HelloFresh's foolproof recipes are super easy to follow and all their ingredients come pre-portioned. And speaking of their amazing ingredients, they travel from the farm to your doorstep in less than 7 days for quality you can literally taste. So if you're worried about your Montreal smoked street whale not being a hit at your next summer barbecue, well, save yourself the embarrassment and try HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code Mrballen50 at checkout for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, use code Mrballen50 at checkout for 50% off plus free shipping. Okay, back to the story. The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor, for a second, thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before, and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today, but the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to. But they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across. And as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended. And at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria. And the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing this segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Austria and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. They began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater. But he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer. And so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry. All I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day, I didn't see him and he never came back. And so I'm sorry. That's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, this search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain, but nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range. But still, they found nothing. And so at the end of this second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place, but they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing, and a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's gonna have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground, and when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. Basically, cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kind of all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. And so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow. And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan, and all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg, and then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down, and then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. And Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier ski resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mrballen Podcast, where we literally have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are only available on the podcast. Again, it's called the Mrballen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.
Today, I'm going to tell you 2 classic spooky stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and dump out all their shampoo, and then refill the bottles with glue. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At 5:15 p.m. on June 28, 1980, a 38-year-old man named Robert Davidson drove his motorcycle down Interstate 74 in Acton, Indiana, which is a small community just outside of Indianapolis. On the back of the motorcycle, with her arms wrapped around his waist, was Robert's wife. Her name was Wanda. The couple was on their way to visit family, and they were hoping to get there as soon as possible, not because they wanted to visit, but because there was a big storm rolling in, and they were hoping to beat the rain. In fact, right now, right above them, the sky was turning a dark gray and looked very ominous. But as Robert nudged his engine to go a little bit faster, these big raindrops began pelting his arms, and he knew the skies were opening up and he would have to pull over so he and his wife could put on rain jackets. And so Robert pulled over to the side of the road, and as soon as he was stopped, Wanda climbed off, and Robert was about to climb off as well and open up the little trunk in the back of the motorcycle to get the rain jackets. But before he did that, there was this sudden flash of light, and then Robert felt pain all throughout his body. His muscles went totally rigid, and then he crumpled off his bike onto the ground, and everything went black. Less than 5 minutes later, an ambulance arrived on the scene, and several first responders jumped out, including a woman named Kimberly Cobb. Now, Kimberly had been briefed up on this situation. A man and his wife had pulled over on the side of Interstate 74, and the man had been struck by lightning. And so as she ran up to the couple, she could see Robert was on the ground. He was not moving. His skin was waxy and gray, and his wife was sort of in shock, and she was standing next to him, just kind of sobbing uncontrollably. And Kimberly, she jumped into action. She jumped down next to Robert, and she felt for a pulse, but he didn't have one. At this point, Kimberly knew she maybe had a couple of minutes here to basically revive Robert, or he was doomed. And so Kimberly, she worked immediately on stabilizing Robert's spine, while one of her team members, one of the other first responders, jumped in and began doing CPR. And then a third first responder hopped on the ambulance radio and called in an emergency medical helicopter to get here and fly Robert to a hospital as soon as possible. They quickly got a response from the helicopter crew saying they were en route. But before the crew or any of the first responders could communicate any further over the radio, suddenly, out of nowhere, their ambulance just completely shut down, like completely shut off. The lights, the sirens, the engine, everything went completely silent. And this was a huge problem because some of the medical equipment that they needed to keep Robert alive until the helicopter got here required the ambulance to be on to use it. And so with the ambulance off, it was useless. But in addition to just what a problem this was, this also was like really confusing to Kimberly and the other first responders. Because when ambulances are built, they are built with the idea that there can never be a situation where the ambulance just totally turns off. Because again, it's like a worst case scenario. And so they give each ambulance 2 batteries, a primary and a backup, so that if for some reason the primary dies, you always have that backup and can always use the life-saving equipment. So the idea that both of these batteries failed simultaneously was like, how? How could that possibly happen? But before Kimberly or the other first responders could even begin to understand how that happened, something else began happening. They turned and saw there was this woman dressed in this old, long black dress running up the road, this desolate highway. This woman is charging up the road, screaming at them, and above her head, she's waving a Bible, and she's yelling at them to, hey, let me touch him. Let me touch him. I can save him. And the first responders are looking at each other like, what is going on here? Now, none of the first responders, nor Wanda, had any idea who this woman was as she continued running up the road, waving her Bible and yelling at them. But again, you need to picture this scene. The ambulance is off. They can't do anything to help Robert. They're basically waiting for the helicopter to show up, which they hope is on the way, but they can't communicate with the helicopter. And Robert basically is clinically dead at this point. He doesn't have a pulse. He's been struck by lightning. Like, there's nothing anybody can do except wait around and hope the helicopter shows up. And so when this woman came running up to the scene saying she could touch Robert and save him, none of the first responders were like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's bring her in. She can save the day. But they were sort of like, well, no one else is doing anything. And they looked over at Wanda, and she was just as shocked as they were at this woman's arrival and what she was saying. And so the first responders and Wanda just kind of stood there and allowed this woman in her black dress with her Bible to just wander up and crouch down next to Robert and begin this totally bizarre ritual. At first, the woman just began praying over Robert, and she's holding her Bible, and she's very focused and she's calm. And again, Kimberly, the first responders, and Wanda, they're all just standing there looking at each other and looking at this woman being like, what is going on here? But then eventually this woman in black, she begins getting really animated and begins slamming her Bible on the ground over and over again and begins screaming up at the heavens, demanding they save this man's life. Now, Kimberly and the others and Wanda, they're all watching this in total shock and just kind of let it keep on happening. Because again, it was sort of like, at this point, we're already committed, and what harm can this woman do? I mean, Robert's clinically dead. And so Kimberly and the others just stood there silently watching as this woman in black continued to slam her Bible and demand that this man be saved. And then it was like something came over this woman. It was like she was completely possessed, and she grabbed her Bible and she lifted it over her head. She's kneeling right beside Robert. And when she opened her mouth and looked up at the sky, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was like another voice, and she began speaking in tongues, things that didn't make any sense. She's saying all these crazy gibberish things to the sky. And as Kimberly and the others are getting frightened by what they're seeing and are about to step in, it was like the woman just stopped. And she stood up slowly, turned, and walked down the road back the direction she came. And within seconds of this woman beginning to walk off, the ambulance turned back on, lights, sirens, the engine all came back on, nothing wrong with it, and Robert began to breathe. Kimberly and the other first responders and Wanda just stared at Robert in total shock. He had not had a heartbeat for several minutes, like he was dead. How he's alive when there was no medical intervention, really, because the ambulance was off? The only intervention was this woman and whatever she was doing? Like, nobody could comprehend that. But before anybody could make sense of that, the medical helicopter arrived, and seconds later it was chaos getting Robert onto the helicopter, and then before long, Robert, Wanda, and the helicopter took off, and then before long, Kimberly and the other first responders were just left there in the first moment of silence they had had for several minutes, just standing on the side of Interstate 74 thinking, what just happened? Now, none of the first responders wanted to admit to this, but they were all thinking the same thing. That woman in black had to have done something that, brought Robert back to life. I mean, there really was no other explanation. However, when the first responders just all kind of looked in the direction where this woman had turned and walked off just a couple of minutes earlier, she was gone. Now keep in mind where she had come from, where she had, run up the road from. It was just one big open road with really no obstructions, and then off to the side of the road was this huge open field. Basically, if someone had been walking for only a couple of minutes in that direction, from their vantage point, they would have seen them. There's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere to go. But she was gone. However, Kimberly and the other first responders would quickly learn that this particular stretch of highway, in fact, more specifically, the field off the side of this highway, had great significance to this whole story. That big field that lined Interstate 74, where effectively the woman in black had disappeared to, used to be the home of a place called the Acton Campground, which was a Methodist community in the 1800s. The members of this community were known for their really loud prayer style and also for speaking in tongues. Now, unfortunately, this community actually burned to the ground in 1864. Afterwards, they rebuilt, but then in 1905, disaster struck again and it burned to the ground again. And this time they did not rebuild. Instead, the community was leveled to the ground, was sold off, and then eventually was just abandoned and became a big empty field. After the story of Robert's miraculous recovery began to spread, some people began to think that the woman in black might have been a ghost of one of these Acton residents from the 1800s who basically was drawn out to save Robert's life. Also, her intense prayers and speaking in tongues, along with the woman disappearing back into the field where the Acton campground had been, certainly seemed to cement the idea that this theory could actually be true. However, since that day in 1980, no one has seen the woman in black again. The show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Your most important relationship is the one you have with yourself. But oftentimes, building that relationship can be hard because we spend a lot of time simply cutting ourselves down when actually we should be trying to build ourselves up. Whether you're going through difficult times or struggling with past traumas or simply just growing up, you still deserve to like yourself. Your self-esteem is really something that's worth looking after, and therapy can help you do that. When I got out of the military in 2017, I basically hated myself. I was angry all the time, I was destroying relationships left and right, and honestly, therapy made the difference. And a great therapy option is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a therapy app that's making therapy more affordable and more convenient. It's fully online and it serves over 5 million people worldwide. Using BetterHelp gives you access to a diverse network of over 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties. And you can easily switch your BetterHelp therapist at no additional cost. Strengthen your relationship with yourself with BetterHelp. Go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen or scan the QR code for 10% off your first month of therapy. One evening in February of 2011, a man in his 30s named Yang was eating dinner inside of his home in a rural village in China. Around him at the table were his 5 elderly aunts, who he lived with and took care of. Now, nobody spoke over dinner. It was totally silent. But this was common, and it was not awkward at all, because Yang actually preferred silence. He had been born with a disability that made it nearly impossible for him to speak. It also had left him blind in one eye, and over the course of Yang's life, he had been sort of bullied for his disability. And as a result, he really didn't like being around other people, and he certainly didn't like trying to talk to other people. I mean, that was really, again, something he had a really hard time doing. But in his life, the few people that totally accepted him and loved him were his family, in particular his 5 aunts. They didn't care at all that basically he never spoke. And so, for example, at this dinner table, there was no expectation that anybody would speak. And Yang loved it. But more than just feeling happy that he could be himself around his aunts, Yang also took a lot of pride in looking after his aunts. He wanted to make sure they were comfortable and well looked after in their old age. So after this silent dinner, Yang stood up and he cleaned the table off, and then he helped one of his aunts go up to her bedroom. And after getting her tucked in, and as Yang was about to go down and help the next aunt go to her bedroom, he heard sirens outside. Now, Yang lives in this very remote rural village in China that's actually so remote they didn't have their own police force. But even more specifically, Yang, literally in his whole life, had never even heard a siren or seen a police car. And so this is like really unique. And so instead of going and helping his next aunt, Yang went outside to see what was going on. And as soon as he got out there, he looked down the hill. He was up on top of this hill. That's where his house was. He saw at the base of the hill, about 600 feet away, were 2 police cars with their lights flashing. I mean, clearly something major was happening in his town. And so again, feeling very curious because he's never seen anything like this, Yang decides to continue to investigate. And so he leaves his home and begins walking down the road towards the cars. But he stops at a safe distance away because 1, he doesn't want to interfere, and 2, he really doesn't want to talk to the police because he can't really talk. And he's actually worried that he's going to get bullied if he talks to the police. And so from a safe distance, he just stood there and watched whatever was going on. And what was going on is the 2 police officers who had responded and shown up in Yang's village were standing there at the foot of this hill trying to make sense of this insane story a local farmer had just told them. The man was sitting there, his face was in his hands, he was crying hysterically, and he was trying to give them more information, but it was like he was too upset. And finally, one of the officers tells the guy, like, hey, stop what you're doing, start all over again, calm down, and just tell us the story from the beginning. And at this, the farmer did calm down, and after taking a deep breath, he told the officer the story. He said about a week earlier, he had this horrible nightmare. He said he dreamed of his mother and she was shrouded in darkness and she was terrified and she was screaming for his help. And the farmer said, in the dream, he ran to his mother to try to save her. But as soon as he would get close to her, it was like this shadow went over his mother and then she disappeared. And then the farmer would wake up and he'd be so terrified and so upset. Now, at first, the farmer told the officer that, he didn't think much of this nightmare. He was not a superstitious person. He just thought, it's a nightmare. But over the next several days, he kept having the same nightmare about his mother that, she was scared and then she would disappear as soon as he went to help her. And so after a week of these horrible dreams, the farmer said he finally decided, I'm just going to go check on my mother in person and make sure she's okay. But when he went to his mother's place, his mother was missing and he couldn't find her anywhere. And he had this horrible thought that she'd been abducted. And so he had called the police. Now, the police did understand that it was totally bizarre that they were here ultimately because of some guy's nightmare. But when they went to his mother's place, she really was missing. And so they ultimately told the farmer to just go home and that they would put together a search party and they would look for his mother. And so after the farmer said okay and then headed back towards his place, the 2 officers got back in their cruisers and they drove out of the village past Yang, who was still standing there watching everything happening, back to the police station. And there, the officers immediately coordinated 2 investigative teams that would go out and look for the farmer's mother. Now, one of these teams was sent to a local city to basically canvass the area to see if she was there, but that search proved to be fruitless. And then the other investigative team, they were sent back to the village. And when they were there, they went door to door asking all the residents if they had any idea what happened to this farmer's mother. And it was during this search in the village that they got a tip. And that tip would lead them to a very specific location, Yang's home. And when police went to Yang's home, they found the front door was wide open. But when they walked right up and yelled inside of the home, calling out for Yang, nobody yelled back. In fact, the home was totally dark and silent. And so after a few more minutes of police calling out for anyone inside the home to come out and talk to them and not getting an answer, the police decided to walk inside. And so into this dark, cramped home they went. And as they walked, they noticed there were all these dirty towels and dirty dishes and sort of trash everywhere. I mean, the place was kind of a pigsty. And again, it's eerily silent. Every step they took, they were walking on these boards that creaked with every step. And as they're moving, they're calling out, Yang, if you're in here, come out. But again, it's totally silent. And they eventually make their way to the very back of the home. Now, the police really did not know what to expect when they showed up at Yang's place, but they did hope that by going there, they would somehow, some way find a reasonable explanation for all of this. You know, the dream that kicked off this investigation and this totally bizarre tip they got. I mean, they really just wanted to put this thing to bed, and they were hoping that by going to Yang's place, they would get that. However, when the police walked into the very last room they had not searched yet, the very back of his home, they knew there was no reasonable explanation here. That back room is where Yang's aunts all slept. And when the police walked into that room, sure enough, the aunts were in their beds where Yang had left them. However, the police realized, like, wait a minute, we have been yelling and screaming and trying to get people to come out of the home, yet all these women are still asleep. How could they possibly sleep through all that commotion? But as the police walked up to each of these 5 women, they realized the outlandish tip that had sent them here in the first place had to be correct. It would turn out Yang did not harm that farmer's mother. In fact, he did the opposite. She was one of his 5 elderly aunts, and he went to great lengths to care for each of these women. I mean, he basically would have done anything for them. However, there was a problem. His 5 aunts were dead, and had been for a long time. While Yang considered these women to be his family, literally, I mean, he called them his aunts, in reality, he was not related to them at all. Instead, these were just women from the local village where he lived who had been nice to him. They had all died of natural causes. But Yang didn't understand it when they passed away. Instead, all Yang knew is that he was sort of an outcast and that nobody respected him and he was treated really badly by most people except for these women. They'd been the only people that really cared about him. And so after they died, he felt really sad and lonely. And so, one by one, he dug these women up and brought them home with him and began caring for them as if they were still alive. When that farmer had gone to go check on his mother after having the recurring nightmare about, her going missing, he had gone to her gravesite and found her coffin was literally empty, hence believing somebody had abducted her body. And then the strange tip police got that led them literally to Yang's house was a local had seen Yang carrying a body up the hill to his home. And his home actually was not a typical home. Instead, Yang's home was actually just a cave that he had outfitted with some boards on the ground for a floor and a couple of makeshift beds. Yang was arrested for what he did, but ultimately he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. All of the bodies that Yang stole were reburied, and the farmer's recurring nightmares about his mother stopped as soon as her body was returned to her grave. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One evening in November of 2016, a professor was sitting outside in his backyard during a torrential thunderstorm. The sky was black, rain and hail were falling everywhere, and all around him, all he could hear were countless sirens. The city was in the middle of a full-scale disaster. But this professor was not actually shocked, because the day before, he had predicted this, and he had tried to warn people, but his warning had not worked. And now, people were dying in the exact way he knew they would. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please buy the like button, a gift certificate to a massage parlor, but before they go in, make sure to replace all the massage oils with honey and fire ants. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At 5:30 p.m. on November 21st, 2016, Jodie Santoro, who was a 21-year-old mother in Melbourne, Australia, woke up to the sound of her 4-month-old son crying. Outside, there was this horrible thunderstorm going on. All this rain and hail were pelting the roof, and the wind was so strong that all the windows in the house were rattling. Jodie reached over and grabbed her phone on the nightstand and checked the time, and she saw right away that she had overslept. However, it had been a really hot day that day, and she was so drained from the heat and also taking care of a 4-month-old that She wasn't really surprised she had overslept. But as the sound of her son's cries intensified, Jody knew, no matter how tired she was, she needed to get up and go tend to him. But the instant her legs swung off the bed and she actually tried to stand up, she knew something was wrong, and it had nothing to do with being tired. She had this incredible sense of dizziness come over her, and then her chest suddenly tightened up to the point where she could barely even breathe in. She found herself grabbing the bed just to steady herself. However, as alarming as this was, Jody didn't panic. She knew this feeling. She had been dealing with asthma for years, and she knew this was the start of an asthma attack. And so Jody reached over for her inhaler on the nightstand. She picked it up, brought it to her lips, pressed it down, and then took in a measured breath of the medication, expecting to pretty much immediately feel relief. But she didn't. The inhaler wasn't working. Jody again pressed down the inhaler harder this time and took a bigger breath in, hoping that a bit more medication might do the trick. But again, it just was not working. And so now with panic rising inside of her, as she's, still struggling to breathe, her son is still freaking out and she can't tend to him. And all she was thinking is, I have to get my nebulizer, which is basically a more robust version of an inhaler. It provides more medication more quickly into your body. However, the nebulizer, which was just over in her closet, required some setup. And she knew she felt so frantic right now and she was shaking so much that she didn't think she'd be able to set it up or even set it up in time before she passed out. Just then, her fiance walked into the bedroom, drawn there by the sound of their son crying. But the second he walked in, his attention was not on their son, it was instead on Jody, who by now was clutching the bed and kind of hobbled over and very clearly having some sort of medical emergency. Jody turned to him and began to say, I can't breathe. But her fiance already knew she had asthma. He knew what these attacks looked like. And so without even needing to be told, he rushed to the closet, set up her nebulizer, and then put the mask right over her face. And as soon as it was, Jody took in the biggest inhale she possibly could, really believing this was going to stop the asthma attack. But just like the inhaler, the nebulizer didn't work. It felt like with every breath she was taking, her lungs were shrinking, not expanding. And so Jody turned to her fiance and croaked out, "Call an ambulance," her voice barely audible. And so her fiance, who also was now beginning to panic, grabbed the phone, and as he was talking to the dispatcher, trying to relay all the details of what was happening, outside this thunderstorm was only getting worse and worse. The hail and the rain were battering the sides of the house, and all the windows were shaking. I mean, it was absolute bedlam inside of this house. The next few minutes were torture for Jody. She laid on the bed waiting for paramedics. Her breaths at this point were so small, so shallow, like she knew she was about to pass out any second. And then finally the paramedics rushed inside. She knew there were 2 people in the room, but it was so chaotic. And all she could say when they showed up in the room was, "I'm going to die. I'm going to die." The paramedics lifted her off the bed, they put her on the gurney, and as they wheeled her out the door towards the ambulance, her world went totally black. We're all looking for a fresh start this time of the year. Whether it's trying to eat better or lose weight, we all have some bad habits we're trying to stop and some good habits we're trying to start. Well, make this the year that you finally start to get out from being under that crushing debt. And the first step to doing that is contacting PDS Debt for a personalized solution. Before I became Mrballen, my wife and I definitely struggled financially and definitely fell into some debt. Had we had PDS Debt at the time, I would imagine that would have made our lives a whole lot easier. PDS Debt has customized options for anybody struggling with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or medical bills. If you're making payments every month on your debt and your debt is still not going down, PDS Debt has solutions for you. PDS Debt strives to understand your specific scenario to help provide alternative solutions to becoming debt-free. Everyone with $10,000 or more of eligible debt qualifies, and there is no minimum credit score required. Save more while paying off your debt in a fraction of the time. Make this the year you take control of your debt. Get a free debt analysis right now at pdsdebt.com/Mrballen. It only takes 30 seconds. Again, that is pdsdebt.com/Mrballen. Okay, back to the story. The paramedics rushed Jody to Sunshine Hospital, and on the way, they tried to stabilize her by squeezing these oxygen bags, forcing oxygen into Jody's lungs. And as they were doing that, Jody's fiance was following the ambulance right behind, white-knuckling the steering wheel, praying his fiance was going to survive this asthma attack. When the ambulance finally arrived at Sunshine Hospital, The emergency room was mayhem. Paramedics quickly wheeled Jody in on her gurney, shouting out her vital signs to the doctors waiting near the door. Her fiancé, meanwhile, watched helplessly as the medical staff surrounded her and inserted IV lines, hooked up monitors, and began intubating her to force even more oxygen into her lungs. But fortunately, this rapid medical intervention, once Jody got to the hospital, appeared to work, because not long after getting there, Jody did begin to stabilize, not enough to suggest that she was actually all better, but her condition basically began to improve. However, the moment she began to improve, instead of the medical team, talking to her and figuring out what happened and making sure she really was on a path to recovery here, instead, the medical team literally ran out of her room, back out to the front of the ER, because by this point, the Sunshine Hospital ER was overflowing with patients. There were all these people in the waiting room and also outside, and basically everybody had the same symptoms as Jody. They couldn't breathe. There were people slumped on the ground against the wall, screaming for help. I mean, the medical team was totally overwhelmed. And on top of that, there were ambulances literally lined up around the block waiting to drop off patients. There just wasn't any more space. But nonetheless, doctors and nurses and the medical team at the hospital worked furiously, moving from one patient to the next, sometimes in an exam room, sometimes out in the waiting room, sometimes outside. It's wherever the patients were. But the weird thing is all these people, they had the same symptoms, these severe asthma attacks, yet many of the people that were showing up had never had asthma in their lives before. So how was this happening? This went on for hours and hours. And really, the situation in the hospital only continued to get worse, with more and more patients showing up with worse and worse symptoms. And so during this madness, Jody, who really hadn't gotten better, she just stabilized, she actually was moved out of the emergency room and over to the ICU, pretty much just to create one more space for new patients. And so in the ICU, Jody's fiance sat next to her, gripping her hand, listening to the sound of the monitors beeping steadily all around her. Outside the room, he could see doctors and nurses and medical staff sprinting up and down the hallways, looking frantic and worried. He had no idea what was happening here. He just hoped Jody would be okay. But it would turn out there actually was someone who knew exactly what was going on. A university researcher named Philip Taylor had actually predicted this the day before. Professor Taylor was an expert in atmospheric allergens, a field so niche that barely anybody outside of his small research circle had even heard of it. And so on the afternoon of November 20th, the day before, Taylor had been at home in his office analyzing data when he noticed something very alarming. All of the ingredients for a catastrophic event were aligning in the forecast, and the patterns were so precise that it stopped him cold. Taylor was stunned. He'd spent years studying the effects of weather on public health, but he'd never seen anything like this before. And at the same time, Taylor also realized that as alarming as this was, very few other people, if anybody, would see this as a problem. He was like the one person in the world that had the expertise to see how catastrophic this might actually be. And so, desperate to warn others, he wound up posting a very urgent announcement on this weather website that he managed. But unfortunately, it just wasn't seen by enough people in time. And so now, as hospitals all across Melbourne overflowed with people gasping for air, Taylor sat in his backyard watching the storm unfold. The sky was pitch black, rain and hail was coming down, the wind was whipping, and off in the distance, all he could hear was thunder and sirens. And he knew, unfortunately, his prediction had been right. Just like Professor Taylor's weather models had predicted, on November 21st, 2016, Melbourne, Australia was hit by an extremely rare event known as thunderstorm asthma. This deadly phenomenon can only occur when three very specific weather conditions align. 1, high heat during the day. 2, a very powerful thunderstorm. And 3, extremely high pollen levels. Melbourne's heat that day had caused unusually high concentrations of ryegrass pollen to hang in the air. And then when that huge thunderstorm rolled in, the intense humidity, the wind, and the rain shattered the pollen grains into microscopic fragments. And then these tiny particles, which were way smaller than regular pollen, were carried by this storm deep into people's homes and into their lungs. Unlike normal pollen, these microscopic fragments bypassed the body's typical defenses and embedded themselves deep into people's lungs, causing severe and sudden asthma attacks. Now, for people who already had asthma, this was catastrophic. But even perfectly healthy people found themselves gasping for air, overwhelmed by the sheer density of this microscopic pollen. The storm had essentially made the air everybody in Melbourne was breathing deadly. As for Jody Santoro, she would spend days in the ICU, hooked up to monitors, with machines pumping oxygen into her lungs while her body fought to heal. But she was lucky. She would eventually recover. And in the days that followed, she would learn the full scale of what actually happened in Melbourne. Nearly 10,000 people had flooded the hospitals across Australia, complaining of the same symptoms that Jody did. And unfortunately, of those 10,000, 10 people actually lost their lives, and many of them were totally healthy and had never had an asthma attack in their lives before. For Jody, despite surviving this ordeal, the awful memory of what happened on that night will forever be on her mind. She is now all too aware of how fragile life can be and how quickly things can change. I'm going to play you a clip from my other podcast, Mrballen's Medical Mysteries. After you're done listening to it, be sure to check out Mrballen's Medical Mysteries on any podcast platform. Give it a follow. New episodes every Tuesday. Enjoy.
Early in July of 1982, a corrections officer made his rounds at a jail in San Jose, California. Everything seemed normal as he inspected each inmate's cell. But as the guard peered into the last cell on the row, he was startled by what he saw. The inmate was sitting on his bunk, staring forward, his mouth hanging open. He looked completely frozen, almost like something out of a wax museum. The guard gave the cell door a few loud knocks with his flashlight, but the inmate didn't move or even blink. The guard was afraid that the inmate was dead. So he unlocked the door and stepped into the cell, and he got right up next to the inmate, and when he did, he could feel breath coming from the man's open mouth. So he knew he was alive. He gently touched the inmate to try to get him to react, but he didn't, and that gentle tap made the man's whole body rock back and forth on the bunk like a rocking chair. The guy was stiff as a board. The guard had no idea what was going on, and he was feeling very freaked out. But then he noticed the inmate's eyes. They had a look of absolute terror in them. And the guard knew this man needed help right now.
Today, we're going to cover two very strange but very true stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to go skydiving with you, but replace their parachute with an anvil. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in the spring of 1990, a young mother tidied up her family's living room in Pingyang Township, which is a small rural community made up of several villages in southern China. And she was almost done when she heard her 3-year-old twin daughters start to cry. And this really caught her off guard, because even though these kids were only 3 years old and 3-year-olds cry, well, her daughters basically never cried. They were like silent all the time. The girls' names were Shi Tsai and Shi Hongwu, and they'd been really easy babies because they were basically quiet all the time and just wanted to sleep. However, as they got older, their silence became more concerning. All they really wanted to do was just lay around and sleep and do nothing. Even at 3 years old, they hadn't even said their first words yet. So when this mom heard these girls crying, she rushed down the hall to see what was going on. One, just obviously to make sure her kids were okay, but two, just out of curiosity. This is so uncharacteristic to be making any noise at all. And so the mom, she burst into the nursery and she saw her girls in their crib and they were sobbing hysterically, totally upset. And the mother rushed over and she scooped them up and asked, what's going on? Are you okay? But of course the girls didn't say anything because they didn't speak. They just continued to cry. But the mom, she kind of assessed her kids and couldn't see any injuries. They didn't seem sick. They were just upset about something, but she had no idea what it was. And so the mom just stood there comforting her girls. until they calmed down, and then she put them back into the crib and they both went to sleep. And that was it. A couple of days later, and the twin girls were back to their normal routine, being totally silent and sleeping for most of the day. And as the girls slept in their nursery, their mom just went around the house doing some housework, and at some point she walked down the hallway past the girls' bedroom. Now, their door to the nursery was shut, and again, they're just sleeping and being totally quiet. The mom hasn't heard them at all day. And as she's walking down the hallway, she suddenly comes to an abrupt stop right outside the nursery door, because distinctly she can hear her girls making noise in their room. But they're making a noise that just doesn't make any sense to the mother. Her daughters were not crying or fussing or anything like that. They were talking. At first, the mother wanted to rush in there and experience this firsthand, this landmark moment of her girls speaking for the first time. But she also worried if she went in there, they might go silent and she'd ruin the moment. And so instead, she just pressed her ear to the door and just listened. And as she listened, she really couldn't believe what she was hearing. Because these girls weren't just babbling, saying random words. These girls were having like a full-blown conversation with each other, like adult-level sentences being spoken back and forth. These girls who apparently, at least according to the mother, couldn't even speak. Like, how is this even happening? However, the more the mother listened to her daughters, the more unsettled she became. Not only because, she's listening to her daughters speak for the first time at like an adult level, which is totally bizarre, but the content of this discussion her 3-year-old daughters are having made no sense. These girls were talking about stuff that they could not possibly know. The girls were talking in detail about people and events from a totally different village. A village their mother knew they had never been to, had never even heard of, and certainly didn't know anybody who lived there. Now, in basically every other part of the world, if a mother suddenly heard her 3-year-old twins, who had never said a word before, suddenly having adult-level conversations with each other about people and places that they can't possibly know about, that might be enough to spurn that mother to at least call their doctor. But this mom, well, she lived in Pingyang Township, and that meant, when she heard what her daughters were saying, as alarming as it was, she actually did know what was going on. Pingyang Township has a very strange secret, and that secret is that of the approximately 7,000 residents who live there, over 100 claim to be the reincarnated spirits of people who have died traumatic deaths. And this is not just some wacky thing these people are saying. No, in Pingyang Township, it's not just those 100 people who believe they really are reincarnated. It's the whole community. All 7,000 some odd people 100% believe that these people truly are reincarnated. And so how that plays out is that periodically the reincarnated folks will go to a non-reincarnated person in the township and will claim things like, hey, in my past life, your family owed me a debt, and so now you're going to pay it out. And these non-reincarnated people will absolutely pay that debt. Or in other cases, there have been fights, physical altercations that have come from a reincarnated person approaching a non-reincarnated person and basically saying, in a previous life, you or your family or your relatives insulted me in some capacity, my previous self, and we're going to fight about it right now. And those fights take place in this town, and it's totally normal. But the interactions between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated people in this township, it's not just about conflict. In fact, there's been lots of decisions made in this township that are designed very specifically to avoid conflict between the reincarnated and non-reincarnated. For example, there was a little boy who claimed to be the reincarnated spirit of a pig who was butchered in town, and the butcher, who this boy said butchered him when he was a pig, well, the butcher, to make sure he was not offending this boy or potentially other people who were, the reincarnated spirits of other animals he had slaughtered, the butcher shut down his business just to be like, I don't want to offend you all. I'll find something else to do with my life. And so when this mother heard the sound of her twin girls who had never spoke before, suddenly having this detailed conversation about people and events from this other village, as jarring and shocking as that was for her, because she lives in Pingyang, she instantly understood that the only way my girls could have that information and be able to have this conversation is if they are reincarnated spirits. And so this mother did what she thought was right, which was not to call a doctor, but instead to get the word out to the people not just in her village, but across the Pingyang township that her twin daughters are actually reincarnated spirits. The mother's hope was that perhaps there was still family of these reincarnated spirits in this other village her daughters were referencing in their conversation that would find out about this, and maybe they'd want to come here and meet their family who now live inside of her daughters. And sure enough, less than a week after this mother got the word out, this man and woman who she didn't know came knocking at her door. When the mother let them inside the house, her girls immediately recognized them. One of the twins said that this was her mother and father from her previous life. Then the twins, these little 3-year-old girls, went on to tell this unbelievably complicated and sophisticated story about how in their previous life, these twin girls were not actually sisters. Instead, they were best friends, and together they had taken their own lives approximately 1 month before they were reborn in the bodies of these twin girls. And so after that, the twins just continued talking to this man and woman for quite some time, giving specific details about this village that, again, these girls, at least according to their mother, had never been to before. These girls also gave intimate details about these teenage girls' lives and even had information that was very specific to what happened to them when they took their lives and, where their bodies were found. Again, information these girls shouldn't have. And then at some point, the mother of the twins asked this man and woman, like, are these details they're giving you accurate? Is this true? And the man and woman said, yep, it's all true. And then at some point, the twins turned to their biological mother and they told her that the reason they had been silent to this point was because they were trying to keep their reincarnation a secret. And also, the reason they slept all the time is because when they slept, they would dream about their previous lives, which they claimed to miss. To this day, no one's ever been able to offer a better explanation for how these twin girls, these toddlers, had such accurate information about people they had never met and places they'd never been to. Basically, the only explanation that works is that they must actually be the reincarnated spirits of those teenage girls. Pingyang Township remains a hotspot of alleged reincarnations, and nobody knows why. As many of you may already know, we launched the Mrballen podcast 3 years ago on Valentine's Day 2022. Now, it was totally unintentional to launch the show on Valentine's Day, but after doing that, we decided to kind of make it an annual event that every Valentine's Day, we not only celebrate our love for our partners and families and friends, but also our love for the strange, dark, and mysterious. And so to celebrate this year's Valentine's Day, you see what we did there? We are going to host our very first live show of the year, and it will be totally free right here on YouTube. All you have to do is click the link in the description, and that will bring you right on over to the scheduled live show so that you can set a reminder and get a front row seat. Valentine's Day is on Friday, February 14th, and the live show starts at 1 p.m. Eastern. Again, it's going to happen right here on YouTube for free, so go ahead and click that link and enjoy the show. Okay, so this next story is going to sound really far-fetched once it gets going, but stick with it because at the end, there is a crazy plot twist. Like, this is one of the better stories we found in some time, so stick around till the end. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective 4 kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs, who were leashed up outside, began barking really aggressively. Now, for Sarah, this was really alarming because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise. So clearly, something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her, and off to her left and off to her right was just rocky scrubland, and then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive four-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up. And on the back of this creature was this man. Except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now, Sarah was a deeply religious person. And so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature, and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. And she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared, she couldn't move. And she had these 4 kids to look after. And so instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound, and she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point. And Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade, and Sarah immediately thinks it's the devil. The devil's come back, and so she screams, and the kids are screaming. But then, on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, hey, what's going on here? Let us in. And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream, which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet. No idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. And so the 2 men, they grab their guns and lanterns and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the 2 men, they began making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first they were walking, kind of keeping their composure, but quickly as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. And she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the 2 husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse. And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big 4-legged creature that was all red, and she heard the scream, which must have been Elizabeth, and so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth. And so ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened here, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier had heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname. Together, they were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard this story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claimed to have seen the Red Ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claimed that in the middle of the night, the Red Ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the Red Ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the Red Ghost, in turn, took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the Red Ghost out in the wild, persisted for years, until about a decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called Red Ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the Red Ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the Red Ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. And the Red Ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the Red Ghost was, what was causing all these stories to spread over so many years. And when he got out there and actually looked down at the Red Ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the Red Ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the Red Ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was. But for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the Red Ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person. But when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her. And so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel escaped, he died and somehow didn't fall off, and his dead body remained in an upright seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the Red Ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzsite. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought of today's episode, and also remember, we have hundreds more videos for you to binge right now. But if you want a recommendation of, which video to invest your time in, well, here are two great options right here. If you want more Mrballen content, click on this one. And if you want some redacted declassified mysteries with Luke LaManna, click over here. All right, until next time, see ya.